I wonder if Jewish people today relate themselves back to one of the Pharisees or Sadducees or something like that.
They actually, I'm on, so we'll talk about that, but they actually do. Yeah. They actually align more closely with the Pharisees than any of the other groups. Well, good morning. We're one past, so we'll go ahead and get started. If everybody will come in. So this morning we're wrapping up our series on the intertestamental period, the so-called silent years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we're going to wrap up this morning talking about some of the sects that arose during this time among the Jews. So let's start with a scene from the New Testament, actually, where Paul's been dragged before the Sanhedrin. And in this passage, we'll see several things that we don't recognize if we had just read the Old Testament and went straight into the New Testament. So Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck?" Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people.'" Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out to the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am about to put on trial." And when he had said this, a dissension arose among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees party stood up and contended sharply. "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?" So here you've got the Sanhedrin, you've got the Pharisees, you've got the Sadducees, you've got the scribes. So where did all these folks come from? So during the 400 years between the Old Testament concluding the story there and the beginning of the the beginning of the resumption of the story with the New Testament, you've got a lot of stuff happening politically, religiously, culturally among the Jews, and that's what we've been talking about the last 5 weeks. In particular, though, the real root of a lot of these sects comes down to the Hellenists versus those who were the conservative or the traditionalist within the Jewish culture. And so the Hellenists, as you remember, are the ones that were willing to adopt the Greek way of life from the people who had conquered them, the people that were governing them. They were all in on adopting the Greek culture and merging that and synthesizing that with their own Jewish heritage and beliefs. So it wasn't that necessarily that these folks wanted to abandon the Jewish practices, but they felt like they needed to adapt to the culture and merge these things together. And so those were the Hellenists. You've got what was developing during this time as a distinct entity, though. You've got what were called the Hasidim, or the Hasidim, however you want to pronounce it. These were the ones that wanted to completely reject any notion of adopting the Greek culture. And so they were considered the pious ones, and they started more and more separating themselves from the Hellenists in the form of political parties. And when I say political, in our culture, we can easily separate religion from politics, usually, right? It's more natural for us to be able to do that. In their culture, this was not something that was so easily done. So politics and religion were tightly intertwined during this time period. And so when I call them political parties, it's both political and religiously, they were separating themselves from each other. So the Hellenists, they start becoming the party that's really in control of the high priesthood, which means they also controlled the Sanhedrin at this time. And we'll talk more about what the Sanhedrin is later. But I think you guys have a general notion that it's basically a kind of a supreme court for the Jewish people. Those Hellenists then are really the ones who form the party of the Sadducees. Okay, the Hasidim, the pious ones, they start forming up and form a little bit later into the party of the Pharisees, and then slightly later from that, the Essenes. And so we're going to talk more about those. Okay, so who were the Pharisees? So the Pharisees, as I said, were those pious ones that wanted to reject the Hellenist ways. They wanted to maintain the Jewish ways. They first show up by name in history, in the record, during the period of the Hasmoneans. So this was after the Maccabees revolt, and shortly thereafter, when the Hasmonean dynasty comes into play, the Pharisees start emerging as an organized party. Prior to that time, we really don't see them in the record. We do see, what could be early instances of them through the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees trying to force conversion and force rejection of the Jewish way of life completely. But the Pharisees really start forming into this party during those years. Right about the middle of the Hasmonean dynasty, we start seeing them mentioned by name. Josephus describes them as appearing more religious than others and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. These Pharisees, of course, returning from the years before, when they returned from the captivity, the temple was being rebuilt. There was a lot of things that happened during captivity, where the synagogues had started coming into play as points of assembly and worship that were outside of the temple, out of necessity. Well, the Pharisees really embraced the synagogues, and they embraced the notion of a religious focus that was not necessarily embedded in the temple. Okay, so this was kind of a major shift in the Jewish way of thinking during this time period, where prior to this and in the Old Testament, you see all the worship is really centered around the temple activities. Now, there were laws associated with all kinds of daily life activities, but in terms of the worship, the real focus was on the temple and the practices there, and that was really manifested in the priesthood and the priests that were running the rites. Okay, the Pharisees started developing and then really ran with this idea of expanding religion beyond the temple and into daily lives. So they focused on prayer, lots of rites around that, teaching in the synagogues, almost, I don't want to use the term too loosely, but democratization of their religion. So they wanted to really shift it away from the priesthood into the people. And there's a few reasons for that. One is practicality of their situation. Another is, during this time period, you remember the Hasmoneans had installed a priest that was not of the right line, and they had taken over the ruling of the nation, again, not from a Davidic, they installed a king that wasn't from the line of David. This really rubbed a lot of people in the Pharisees, were the manifestation of that, the wrong way. And basically they called it out as an evil practice. And so they had really turned against the priesthood as representing the pious notion of the Jewish nation. So they were clearly trying to separate themselves from the temple worship as much as possible. They were focusing on what was called the rabbinical type of Judaism, which means you had teachers that weren't necessarily priests that were really becoming the focus of religious practice and religious interpretation. Okay, the Pharisees are the ones that really pushed that into the Jewish society. And a question came up about today, would you recognize any of this in the current Jewish practices? Today's Jews are as diverse as Christianity, right, in terms of the number of denominations, the number of different practices. But in general, the only party from this time that survived into modern days were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees nobody adopts that name anymore, but you may have heard of Hasidic Jews. They came from this line of the Jewish sects. Okay? Did that answer that question? Yeah. Okay, so what were some of the characteristics of the Pharisees? They accepted the entire canon of the Old Testament, much like we do. Okay? They, and we'll see this as a distinction later with the other parties, but they additionally, other than just taking the written canon that we've got in the writings that are the Torah, they also accepted as 100% binding on them the oral law. And today that oral law has been written down, but back then the oral law was considered the things that Moses had instructed them orally and had not put them down into the Pentateuch, right? So there were lots of explanations of things. There were lots of interpretations that had been passed down. Some of these obviously changed over time, and in fact, if you look today at today's writings that capture this oral law, they have evolved over time to kind of match changing needs, changing cultures, etc. But to them, to the Pharisees at this time period, they considered this oral law the things that Moses had been told by God that weren't written down, as well as a lot of other stuff. So if you look at the oral law in its written form, which today you can find in the Talmud, there's about 8 different categories of things in there that they've broken it out. And one of the things they did and the Talmud was actually written down about the 1st or 2nd century AD, after Christ. And it takes the laws, the 613 laws that are actually from the written law, and all of the oral laws, and it breaks them up into categories. So if you, as a person, wanted to know what my behavior should be on the Sabbath, I can go to a tractate within the Talmud, and I can find the category on Sabbath, and they've elucidated all the laws that apply. Okay? So they reorganize stuff. But at the time, the Pharisees were known for accepting that oral law, and not only accepting it, but it made it just as binding as the written law. And so when you see a lot of the criticisms of Christ later as he's interacting with the Pharisees, a lot of it comes from the fact that they were binding things that they necessarily weren't written down or that were just considered traditions. And you'll see that those traditions weren't always bad, but they weren't always accepted widely by everyone because they weren't written down in part of the canon that everybody could see. All right. They also, they also believed in rituals that were really intended in the written Torah for the temple worship, in terms of purification, in terms of a lot of the cleansing rituals and things like that. They believe those apply to individuals as well. So they took a lot of the temple practices, again, that we said that they were trying to shift away from the temple practices necessarily, and they implemented them into daily lives. So there's a lot of rituals associated with that. They put importance on fasting as something that's evolved during this time in terms of the emphasis on it. One of the other key things that we saw in that passage from Acts is the belief in the human soul being enduring. You know, it goes beyond the physical life. They believed in the resurrection. They believed in the angels. So these are things that you'll see kind of evolve during this time in terms of a conflict over those. And later we'll talk about the Sadducees and the way they approached that. They did go to some extremes when it comes to this oral law that they followed. So I mentioned here, you know, a woman was not to look in a mirror on the Sabbath lest she be tempted to pluck a gray hair out, which they would consider that a violation of the Sabbath, to pluck a hair out of your head. And then I even found a reference where there was a discussion about whether an egg laid on a festival day could be eaten because the hen may not have known it was a Sabbath and laid this egg in violation of God's law. If you look at the oral law in the form of the Talmud today, it's actually a very interesting read because they spend a lot of time. Again, it's not a singularity thing. Like I said, there's about 8 different categories, and there's actually different ways they've addressed it. Some of them are simple, just stating the principle. A lot of them, though, have discussions with them. It's almost like a debate format, where one rabbi will say this, and another rabbi will say this, and somebody will ask a question, and they'll answer it. Fascinating stuff. If you ever get a chance or just got the time, you'll find it entertaining to say the least. Okay. Here's an example of oral law that you would find. So they took the verse in Ezekiel that says the priest must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their heads trimmed. Straightforward enough, right? What they derived as another additional oral law from that, or derived or were told or learned or was passed down to them, was that the high priest must cut their hair weekly. Okay, so why? If they're just keep their hair trimmed, why do they have to do it weekly? Well, the high priest, not only that, they have to have it done on the eve of the Sabbath. Okay, why? Well, because that's when the high priest shift changes. So the incoming high priest has got to be completely trimmed up, and since you never know, even though there's a schedule for these things, you never know, you might be called forward. You have to have your hair cut every eve of the Sabbath. Okay? Ordinary priests, not the high priest, the ordinary priests have to do it every 30 days. Okay? So how did they get there? Well, if you look in the prescription for the Nazirite vow, so hang with me here, we'll get there. If you look at the prescription of what it takes to be a Nazirite, it basically describes the Nazarites as having uncut hair that becomes long. So there's a definition in there that basically long. Well, the Nazarite vow in another part of their oral law says that it's really a 30-day default. If you don't swear to a certain time, the Nazarite vow applies for 30 days. Okay? And because the Nazarites are described as having long hair, that means 30 days worth of hair growth is to be considered long. And so every priest must have their hair cut at least every 30 days in order that their hair may not be considered long. Okay? Now, where did they get the 30 days? Well, the 30 days is actually the numerical representation of the word holy that's found in the description of the Nazarite. So it's interesting to see the way that these things developed. It's not necessarily just obvious, but at the same time, the way it's reasoned out at least made sense to them. Okay, so that's an example of the oral laws that they established, and this is some of the stuff that Jesus later will start criticizing them for, is that they left completely out of the equation the heart part of this, and the worship part of this, and the God part of this, and made this all about reasoning with human logic to things that they then considered part of the actual decrees from God. Okay, any questions on that? The other thing I had on the chart that I didn't mention was the tradition of the elders. That's kind of a name that they use to represent the oral law. So when you see in the New Testament talking about the tradition of the elders, they're talking about this oral law that the Pharisees held. Okay, Sadducees. Stark contrast with the Pharisees. Their name means righteous ones, possibly. There's a lot of different ways that you can parse this stuff out. It's probably a name that was derived from the sons of Zadok, which that was of course the priesthood that was established back in the Old Testament, and then followed in Ezra. That those were the chosen family that would be the priesthood. So the Sadducees took their name out of that. They, as we said before, came out of the party that was really all for the priesthood and that all the power that went with that. You remember during the previous weeks that the high priesthood had become not only a religious office, but it had become a political office, and it was actually their worldly overseers had been changing it out at will. This had become a really powerful position among the Jews that was going beyond what it was intended in terms of the hereditary nature of it. And so the Sadducees were really embedded one-on-one with that notion of the high priest and the power that comes with that. We'll see in a minute, though, that religiously they did have some stuff that wasn't necessarily related to that, but kind of derived from that. They were fewer in number than the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the largest of the sects. The Sadducees were much smaller, as you can imagine, because they were really about the people that were in power. So that was obviously a smaller set than the more open association of the Pharisees. But they had all the power, or they had a lot of the power. At least during the early days, they kind of ran things, and the Pharisees stayed out of politics and really focused on their practices and establishing themselves. The Pharisees weren't necessarily a party of the people necessarily, but they were closer to that than the Sadducees. They were definitely more friendly to the Hellenists. In fact, they were all usually Hellenists themselves, for the very reason that the people in power were Hellenists, because that's who were the people that could bestow the power were. And so they associated with the Seleucids and the the Ptolemies before that, and then as we approach the time of the New Testament, they were also, although not quite as much, in bed with the Romans. Okay? At some point, though, the Sadducees start really separating themselves from Rome because there was a distinction there with the Herodians, which, we talked about Herod last week. Herod was, for all intents and purposes, a Roman. He was a Roman citizen that he'd been granted Roman citizenship, and he associated himself as a Roman. All his friends were Rome. He was very powerful, very rich. So the Sadducees had really distanced themselves from that, although they were friendly to them because they had to be, for political reasons, to stay in power. And again, in terms of current day, when the Jewish revolts happened in AD 66 to 70, and when Jerusalem was wiped out and the Romans basically eliminated any notion of a Jewish state, the Sadducees evaporated. The high priesthood was gone, their power was gone, and they ceased to exist. So you don't see any records beyond that time period of the Sadducees. Okay, so what were some of the characteristics of the Sadducees? Well, the Sadducees, because they were so intertwined with the priesthood, they held to maintaining the temple as the singular point of worship, and they held to a literal interpretation of just the Torah as canonical. That does not mean they weren't familiar with the other writings and the prophets, but they did not see those as canonical. They did not see that those commands were binding. They were fully focused on the Pentateuch. They rejected all those traditions of the elders that had been coming down, that the Pharisees were holding. They also rejected notions of the spiritual world, including having an enduring human soul that went beyond death, spirits, angels, all of these things they rejected. And their reasoning was, well, do you see it in the first 5 books? Point at it, tell me where it says that there's this resurrection of the dead and stuff. Now, I'm not arguing for them, I'm just saying that that's the way that they approached it. They had a very strict adherence to the law, though. And it was very literal. Okay? So when you see in the law an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that was literal to them. That's the way they wanted to execute justice. All right? This was in clear contrast with the Pharisees, whose oral law basically said, now, the intent is it's the value of an eye, and it's the value of a tooth. So people can make monetary compensation in place of an actual, gouging out of the eye or removal of a tooth. And the Sadducees said, no, you got to do what it says. So when you look at the way that the Pharisees took the oral law, they took a much more, I'm going to say, pragmatic approach to it in terms of the way that they implemented it. Another example is the prohibition against fire on the Sabbath in your home. Okay, Sadducees said, can't have a fire in the house on the Sabbath. The Pharisees said, well, hold it. You can have a fire, you just can't start a fire that day. So if you start it the night before and it's burning through the day, that's perfectly okay. Sadducees, no. So this is the type of collision that you've got between these two philosophies. And again, the Sadducees, because they were of the priesthood, and I shouldn't say because of it, it's one of the characteristics of their association with the temple led them to be more intent on keeping the focus of religious activity at the temple as opposed to the synagogues and the rabbinical teachings that were happening across the nation. Okay. Any questions on the Sadducees? All right, the Essenes. So it's interesting enough that the Essenes, you don't see them in the New Testament. They don't show up by that name. But we know the most about them because they left us such a huge treasure of writings at the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are believed, and there's a lot of rethinking of theories now, modern day, but they're believed to be the ones that collected and stored the treasure of the library that was found at the Dead Sea outside of one of their communities. And so there's a lot of writings that they have there, in addition to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. There's a lot of writings that describe their rights of entry into the community. There's stuff that indicates things like, and we'll get to it in a second. One of their things was they were an apocalyptic community, so they were very focused on the second coming. The first coming of the Messiah, and they had drawn up battle plans even. So they had studied war, which is very interesting because they're a pacifist community. So they did not believe in violence. They did not believe in capital punishment. They didn't believe in inflicting harm on another human being. They didn't believe in animal sacrifices. But part of their writings is basically articles that describe how to conduct a war so that they would be ready for the impending conflict that was coming with the arrival of the Messiah. Scholars believe that the Essenes were originally part of the line of priests that were supplanted by the Hasmoneans whenever they took power. There was a hereditary line of priests coming from Zadok, and when the Hasmoneans and the Seleucids originally had started selling the high priesthood, it pushed those people out. And so scholars believe that the true priests separated from the community and started the Essenes. Now, the Essenes are not just the one community at the Dead Sea. They actually had numerous communities, and they had a little bit different rules for those. You see writings from Josephus. He describes the Essenes. Another Jewish historian called Philo, who wrote just before, actually, Josephus, he mentions them. And then the Roman historian Pliny the Elder talks about the Essenes. And in all three cases, they have slight differences in their description. And this really kind of puts you to the notion that they were multiple communities, some living in the Qumran region around the Dead Sea where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, but there were others scattered throughout Judea. Their original leader, like I said, was probably the supplanted priest. They called him the teacher of righteousness in their writings, and their writings definitely cast a very negative light on the current line of priests that had been serving, because they considered them supplanters of the real righteous one. Okay. Like I said, you don't see any interaction with these in the New Testament, but if you look at their writings, some of their practices will lead you to believe that I'll just give you for instance. So they lived a very monastery-type style. In at least several of their communities, they were celibate, they were male only, they basically lived as monks. They spent a lot of time writing, rewriting the law, studying very intently, almost like the Pharisees, except they were really focused on the priesthood aspects of it. But in terms of their philosophy and their religious viewpoints, they were more aligned with the Pharisees. So they probably came at least somewhere there was a lot of interaction with the Pharisees in the way that they interpreted the scripture. Now, they were very much separatist, and you couldn't just walk out and join an Essene community. It was actually a 3-year process, according to their laws of entry, their ritual. So it was 3 years of various practices and activities. It actually came to fruition in a baptism. So they actually baptized their members into the sect at the end of that 3 years of various rituals and various things that they taught them. So it was a lot of intense training that went on before they allowed these people in. Their view on angels, and I wish I had had more time, it's very interesting. They not only embraced the idea of the spiritual world and angels, but they actually expanded from what I think we even do. One of their acts of training that they had before they were allowed entry is you had to learn all the name of their angels. So they believed in personal angels that were attending to individuals. And so this was kind of unique among the Jewish community in that the Pharisees believed in angels, but not necessarily the way that the Essenes did. And again, the Roman-Jewish Civil War that happened wiped out the Essenes. The Essenes, even though they were pacifist when that war started, I don't know if they thought that was part of the apocalyptic activity, but they actually did join in and took responsibility of a certain area that they were around and fought battles with the Romans of which they were not successful. So they were wiped out. We don't see them until 1946 when the shepherds stumble into one of their caves and find one of the troves of documents. They've since then, and they're still finding them, there have been multiple caves found with lots and lots of writings. Some of them are just fragments, some of them almost complete. There's one scroll, writing that's written on copper. It's called the Copper Scroll. And basically it's if you could interpret it correctly, it's a map or a description of where they have cached finances for the incoming wars. So it's like a treasure map that's out there. As far as I know, no one's ever found any treasure using it, but it's just kind of interesting that type of stuff has survived for us to see. Okay. Talked some about this, but there are a couple of points on here. They had eliminated animal sacrifices. And part of that was that they only believed the animal sacrifices should be done at the temple, and since they had separated themselves from the temple because of its corruptness, they basically did not practice those within their communities. They banned slavery. So at this time in history, slavery was fairly common, even among the Jewish people. The Essenes saw that as an abomination against the equality of God's treatment of the human being and banned it. So they were much more in line with the notion that all men are equal and they served one another. So they had a very servant attitude. I said they had the practice baptism as a rite of entry. They also had a daily ritual of cleansing with water, which if you're in a desert community, that's a fairly significant thing to have as part of your rites. So every morning there was a particular routine they went through, which included a water cleansing of every member of the community. All right. The Zealots. Okay, everybody remember Simon the Zealot? Well, the Zealots weren't a religious sect. They were a political movement. And it got its start with as a distinct party from a revolt that happened in 6 AD. So remember last week what happened in 6 AD? This is not a quiz because I don't expect you to remember this, but in 6 AD, Herod's son Archelaus, who had wrecked the administration of Judea with his incompetence, is removed. Even though the Herods were very, very liked in Rome, they couldn't. The Roman way of thinking would not allow any kind of hiccup in collecting their taxes and administering their government. And so Archelaus was a disaster. He gets deposed, and Quirinius is installed as the procreator of Judea by the Romans. So this is when the Romans took control of, in person of Judea. Well, when he did that, he had a census for the purposes of getting the tax rolls established. This did not go over well with the population, and there was a revolt that was led by this Judas of Galilee. And coming out of that, even though that revolt was put down, coming out of that, the Zealots formed up a party and started basically organizing for revolts that happened throughout the years. They were uncompromising in their goal of Jewish independence. They didn't spare anybody. If you were a Jewish collaborator, you were likely to fall under their sword just as much as the Roman that you were collaborating with. They refused to pay taxes. Of course, this went well over with Rome. They considered it a sin to be loyal to Rome. They were not a religious movement, but most of them, probably because of the structure of the time, would line more closely with the Pharisees in how they approached religion. They're the ones, though, that started the revolt that wound up costing the Jews their nation, their temple, everything, later with Rome. And even in that situation, they were so intent and so feverish about their pursuit of independence that they made some huge mistakes that really caused a lot of suffering. One of the things, Jerusalem had come under siege. The Zealots felt like they needed to really inspire and get the people involved in beating back the Romans. So they went in and burned the food supplies. So there was probably about 4 or 5 years worth of food that had been built up within Jerusalem to withstand this siege. The Zealots destroyed it all, and that led to mass starvation in the city. And so Jerusalem really caught the brunt of a lot of stuff, not only from the Romans when they kind of came in and leveled the city, but the suffering of the people prior to that because of some of the Zealots. All right, we got about 2 minutes. We talked, another group that comes up in the passage we read in Acts are the scribes. So the scribes, again, were not a unique religious movement. They were a professional organization. So there were scribes that belonged to the Pharisees. There were scribes that belonged to the Sadducees. There were scribes that were in the Essene communities. And scribes were basically the lawyers of the population. They were very educated. They did do stuff that you would think of a lawyer doing, like writing out marriage contracts and stuff like that. But they were also the experts in the law. And they, as a profession, they would say that they came from Ezra, who upon return had basically gone about learning the law and relaying it to the people. The scribes were the ones that really were looked at as the rabbis in a lot of situations. They were held in high esteem. Their rulings and their words on things were taken in a lot of cases as law. And they approached everything from a legalistic standpoint. So everything was about writing. So when you look at like the Talmud, where I talked about the oral law when it was written down, there's a lot of reasoning that's going on there from a legal standpoint that you see elucidated. And the scribes were really ones doing that. They had prominent seats in the Sanhedrin because they were the people that were supposed to have known the law. So if you needed to know a specific thing about the law, you would go to a scribe and they would give you a ruling or a retelling of the applicable passages. And then last, in the 1 minute we got left, the Sanhedrin. You see the Sanhedrin as a governing body. It changed over time. It's not exactly clear when the first community that was called the Sanhedrin was mentioned or developed, but you see it, the first clear mention when in the Seleucid rule, the Antiochus the Great was ruling, and there was the body of the Sanhedrin was convened. And if you remember, under the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the Jewish nation was granted a lot of local control and governance, and the Sanhedrin was kind of the Supreme Court that was put in place. They would claim that they come back from the 70 members that the 70 people that Moses had appointed to help with the governance of people. These they would say represent those 70. There was the Great Sanhedrin that had those 70 members that met in Jerusalem. The control of that changed over time. Originally, the Sadducees were in firm control of the Sanhedrin because of the high priest. When the high priest's role had been decimated during the various times when control had been taken over, the Pharisees had in negotiations for the way that the Jewish people were going to respond, had gradually built up their participation in the Sanhedrin, and to a point, when you got to the point of Christ, there were a lot of, we don't know exactly what the numbers were, but they were probably close to even between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And like I said, there were multiple Sanhedrins because when the Romans came in and established control, they had the Great Sanhedrin allowed. They also established 5 different Sanhedrins that ruled each of their provinces that they had laid out. So there was a Sanhedrin that was operating out of Galilee. There was another one that's actually down in Egypt. So there's several different Sanhedrins. The one we see interaction with in the Bible, of course, is the one in Jerusalem that's considered the greater Sanhedrin. Okay, I am out of time. Looks like we got some people standing out there. I am more than happy to answer any questions I can afterwards. I hope the last few weeks have been informative. Next week, Jack's going to talk to us about conversational evangelism. So looking forward to that. So